Hey guys, welcome to the first ever build video, part of 13thSquadron. This one's going to be over the Mini Zero with a 30-inch wingspan by 28-inch length. It runs off of the Flight Test F-Pack and A-Pack motors, along with a 3-cell A50. And overall, it's just an amazing flying plane. It flies on rails. It's just the true design of the Zero. I've always wanted to do one, and that's pretty much why. There's so many iconic angles and challenging parts of the Zero, and I figured I'd try it out for you. Now, there are free planes at 13thSquadron.com. I'd love for you to give it a try, show it off. Join our Facebook group too. I can help you out there if you have any more questions. I hope this build video helps out a lot. It's the first one I've ever done, so if there's any problems with it, sorry for that, but at least I'm trying, I guess. Glad I can do this for you. I have some time. Let's get started. Alright, so the first thing we're going to do is make sure we have all of our pieces cut out. There's a total of 32 pieces, and we have basically all of our fuselage pieces right here, our wings over here, along with our 2 spars, cockpit pieces right here. There's a total of 6 pieces. Tail section, and then all the interior fuselage stuff. Now we'll say this piece, cutting it out, this is a questionable piece. It's going to go in the vise, but it's going to be made a lot longer. This is just the amount of minimal pieces. This is going to be for our exhaust over here. The way we do it, we're going to show you, but just letting you know in advance, we're going to cut that down. We have our 2 wing fairings here. Then we're also going to have to make sure we have our electronics. We have 4 4.5 gram servos and our motor and ESC. We're running a 20 amp ESC along with a 2205 2300 kV motor. This is also the Flight Test F-Pack motor, but you can also use the Flight Test A-Pack motor, which runs at an 1806 2300 kV motor. And once you have all this done, we're going to make sure we also have everything done with the foam board. We're going to make sure we have 3 push rods at about 22-inch length, 2 barbecue skewers, our X-Acto blade, hot glue guns on, and a rubber band. And we're going to make sure we have everything ready, and we're going to get started. Okay, so here are all the things for our wings. We have our 2 main wing sheets, our spars, and our dihedral gauge, along with 2 servos and 2 control horns. We're going to set these aside for now, because we're just going to worry about prepping the wing and getting it ready for gluing. We're also going to put the spars to the side, and we're just going to focus on getting it ready by peeling the paper off. Next what we're going to do is go ahead and open up our wing halves, taking it to the edge of the table, lining up those score lines, opening up just slightly, and take our blade and do a double bevel along both surfaces. Careful to not go through the paper. Won't affect the flight performance, just affect the looks, depending on how picky you are. You can also use your table as your friend to do this, but whatever works for you. Doesn't matter if you're fast or slow with this. Next what I'm going to do is also open up our ailerons. It's a little hard to see how you can line it up to the table. Just kind of slowly ease it in, crack it open. And depending on how much throw you want is going to affect how much you bevel. But the Zero is pretty agile, so you don't need a crazy bevel with how big these ailerons are. The Zero is known for having very large ailerons, which is one of the reasons why I could outroll / maneuver almost any fighter it came up against. Just didn't have good armor. Okay. Then from there we can actually go ahead and take out the servo slots. So go ahead and open these up. These ones, make sure you really have them open up, because it can be sort of a pain to get all the foam out in one swipe. Also make sure you're not going through the other side. The easiest way to do it is just by taking a barbecue skewer with the pointy edge, and then just kind of, don't try to do it all in one swipe, but just get all the edges first, make sure they're actually cut. And I usually take it to one corner, get it a little bit of a divot right there, and then take the blunt side and just kind of put some force into it. Usually knocks it pretty clean, but if it's not, all you have to do is either take your knife or the barbecue skewer, just clean it up a little bit. But this one came out pretty good. Same thing to the other side. Then from here we're going to actually go ahead and glue the wings, or not glue the wings together. Well, I guess glue them together. But we're going to put tape down first. You can also check here if we went through the paper with our bevels. There's a little bit here. So what I'm going to do is get some blue tape. And you could use clear tape, but when it's all glued together and there's glue there, it's going to be super strong either way. This just, you can take it off later. We're going to take our clear tape. I'm going to put it basically all on the bottom sheet, nothing at the top. Go ahead and flip this over. Line up each half. Make sure those spar lines indications are where they should be. See how even our bevel was. Looks pretty good. And then from here, what we're going to do is slightly open this up. Bend it just past slightly what we need it to be. And we're actually not going to glue this yet because we have to add our dihedral gauge. We're going to make sure our spars line up. That looks pretty good. And all we have to do is glue them down. Once that's done, and it feels like it is, we're going to take our barbecue skewer, open up the spar slightly, just so we have some bend. And we're going to put a piece of tape over the top section, so that's what's going to give it its complete strength while also a lot of glue going inside. And while we're at it down here, we can just trim off this excess tape on the bottom here. Next thing we're going to have to do with our wings is go ahead and mold them. We could have done it before, but this way we actually have to do it very evenly. It helps us realize what we have to do more and less. And the easiest way to do this is take us to the round table edge. Notice I'm not doing this on this hard edge just because it almost leaves like etch lines from like World War I planes and all those earlier planes. But if you have a round table edge, it makes it a lot smoother and just generally easier to get the right shape. But usually you start off slow and not pushing hard almost at all. You start to see slow and gradual motions. I'm kind of leading more pressure on the front of the wing and not where the aileron line is, 90 degrees to it. You don't want to put a crinkle in the aileron. As it starts getting more and more, you notice there's some slight deflection there. But once it gets to this stage about, you can sort of put more pressure on incrementally, and you really start to see some curves. And you can kind of twist the wing slightly to do it the same angle of the aileron, just so you don't crinkle it. This wing doesn't need much molding, but it just helps either way. You can see there it's pretty aggressive, but now we're going to do the other side. Okay, as you can see there, it's pretty aggressive. We're not going to need most of that at all. It just helps to have in case we need it, no matter which plane you're building. But next we're going to do is go ahead and move on to the servos. Okay, for this next part, we're going to go ahead and put our servos in. We're going to need our 2 servos, our Y harness, 2 control horns, along with our servo tester and a battery to test it. The first thing we're going to do is make sure that we actually have our servos in the correct position. Our 2 servos are going to be on the edge like this, and the actual pivot point is going to be closest towards the leading edge. And we're just going to make sure that we have them lined up. And just kind of set them there so we know what we're doing. Next thing we're going to do is take the smallest X from the control horn package in the flight test box. And now, if you want to have a little more docile experience, you're going to use the shorter arm out of the 2 of these, or out of the 4 of these. Or if you want a little bit more throw and a little more acrobatic flying characteristics, you're going to go ahead and use a longer arm. That's what I'm going for. That's what I'm going for this one. And all you have to do is just simply cut off the ones that you don't want. Just be careful with your fingers in doing this. You only need 1 long arm, so. 3 excess ones. And now, just to make sure we had it right, we're going to go ahead, and even if we didn't test it yet, just put it on so we know which direction it's going to be facing. Same thing to the other side. And there we go, we have both of them set up. Next thing we're going to do is just set them up in our servo tester. I like to do each one individually, just to be safe. It's actually pretty centered. Go ahead and push that one in. Put our shortest screw from the bag in. Grab our screwdriver. If I can get in there. Don't screw it in too hard because you don't want to strip it, and you don't want to strip the gears in the actual servo. Just snug. That one's all done. Same thing to this one. Now one thing is, the Zero is known for being pretty light. If you want to go as light as possible, I recommend stripping off all the stickers. But we're going to need to rip off at least one of them either way, so we can sand down the one side to make it a stronger glue joint. In this case, it's going to be the side that we're looking down on. So either take a piece of sandpaper or another blade if you have one. I usually like to make like a sort of tic-tac-toe pattern. Just be careful of your fingers because this is a little risky, but it adds for a super strong glue joint. You can go the other way. Now if you go this way, the actual manufacturing lines with the way the servo's built, if you actually go right into it, I've never done it before, but you have the potential of risking the servo gears inside. So just be careful in staying away from that area. Once you feel that, it's very sticky. We're going to go ahead and glue them down. Now, we can't really glue it down with the servo down like this, so we're going to just slightly turn it. That way it lays flat. Sits in there good. Once we dry fit it, you know it's good. Go ahead and put some glue down. Once you've waited long enough, it should be good. Next we're going to do is take our Y harness and connect them both. Now depending on who you are, I don't trust these connections. The easiest way to do is just take a bit of tape
Clean off your workbench. Cut it in half. Then I like to wrap it around. This way it'll never come out. Go ahead and do the same thing with the other side. The next thing we're going to do is make sure that we have the servos centered, just so we don't forget about it. Or at least make sure they're all working. It's always a good sound. Seems all good. Then we should be good with all electronics. Now this little hole is going to be for where we have to pass these wires through. But when we have to glue the front down, we almost want to make sure that these are staying in place. So what I like to do, just take a piece of blue tape. And then I just like to tape down these so they don't move, get in the way of gluing that leading edge. Just kind of pull them tight. The next thing we're going to do is go ahead and move and glue our wing together and finish up all the servo wires and the control horns. So the next part in the build is we're going to go ahead and prep our wings for the fold over. First thing we're going to do is, depending if you want to, it just makes it easier. Actually, what we're going to do is tilt our servos down just so they're out of the way, so we can lay our wing flat. Make sure it's all level. Now, depending if you want to or not, we can put a small bead of glue on the inside leading edge, or on the inside aileron hinge, so that way it's stronger over time. Depends on if you want to do it. I usually like to do it, so I'm just going to go ahead and put a very slight bead of glue along it, and make sure you have a scrap piece ready in the meantime. Just very light, and as quickly as possible. Get some glue. Rub about as much off as possible. Once you got all that, make sure to keep it open. So you just keep a piece of tape on the other side. And that'll hold it very easily. Same thing to the other side. Once that's all done, we'll make that very, very strong. Next thing we're going to do is go ahead and glue our top halves down. And the best way to do that is pick a side. We're going to go ahead and do this side first. And just start by folding it over. Make sure it's all good. Well, actually, before we do that, go ahead and flip it upside down. And we're going to add a piece of tape on each halves here. But I need some thicker tape. So, thicker the tape, the better for this. Get a decent sized piece and just put it right on that leading edge cut that leads to the bottom. This will prevent it from ripping right there. It's a very stressful point. We just want them to want the planes to look clean and good, so now we can comfortably do that. Make sure you put pressure along the whole leading edge. see that looks pretty good. Aileron servo Y harness looks pretty good. Once that looks right, you can go ahead and glue that down. If you want to glue the trailing edge all in one, you can do that. But if you want to leave that out, go back later, doesn't matter. I'm going to do it all in one sweep. Just be careful doing this, make sure you go fast, don't go too slow. Make sure your servos stick out. Just make sure you're applying even pressure everywhere, thinking of all the places where the glue is. Once that's all done, we can go ahead and take off this blue tape here, holding this aileron down. See how that looks. Looks very clean. The more patient you are, the better your plane will come out. See here, we still have the open inside. Go ahead and tape this one back down. Then we can just go ahead and do the same thing to this side. Okay, so once we have our wing halves done, we're going to go ahead and take off the tape from these wing edges. Just be careful. Make sure you don't accidentally rip it. If there's an accidental cut. This is from the time when I went through the paper. And as you can see, might not be able to tell, but you can't even see it on the camera basically. Usually like to try and always try to peel away or peel towards the edge of the paper. As you can see here, you don't risk even peeling it up at all. Then from there you can kind of notice, you can see your wing leading edge or wing edges, and notice if you have one more or less. Now that will affect the plane. So you can just kind of look at it straight on, see how even they are from all angles. Try and even them out. Don't put too much pressure on it or you might crinkle it. Overall it looks pretty clean. Next thing I'm going to do is go ahead and glue our wings together, add the dihedral. The way we're going to do this is just kind of set it down flat. I'm going to pick up one edge and put it underneath there. There may be a gap here. That's fine. The tape will clear that up and make it super strong. It'll help it even more than the glue does. The easiest way to do this is just stick some glue inside there, and we're going to smear it over top. Once it's all done, make sure you have a scrap piece handy. Just watch out for your Y harness, make sure it doesn't get in the way. Go ahead and bring it past where it needs to be, and just hold it. Now this plane could use more dihedral, so if you don't want to go crazy, you can actually add a little more dihedral if you want, just by holding it up slightly where it should be. But I have it set to the scale dihedral. Once it's all done, you can move your dihedral gauge and notice it's still strong, but not nearly as strong as it should be. See there? Sorry, my dihedral. But to make it super strong, take a piece of tape. I usually like to have the gauge underneath it just to be safe. Go ahead, add a piece of paper, a piece of tape. I'm a little long on this one, but and then just press it down, making it super strong. Like to take your fingernail, kind of really get it bonded to the pieces of paper. Then just trim the excess. Once that's done, you'll notice it's super strong, never coming apart. And now, the wing gets a lot of strength. The wing doesn't need necessarily as much strength as it does pushing down this way, as it does needing going upward. But when we actually put the fuselage on, it'll make it super strong, and it will almost never come apart. It'll add so much strength. But now we can go ahead and move on to our servos. Another thing we're going to need for that, 2 control horns, one of our push rods. We're not going to need nearly as much as this. First thing we're going to do is just go ahead and sit our control horns in place. We have our little notch here cut open. Just go ahead and open it up. Just be careful not to rush through this and rip the whole control horn, making a giant crease down here. Once that's in place, just put it down. Add a piece of tape to the actual control horn edge, making sure it's nice and straight. Now, one thing we're going to look for is making sure that that hole is right above the actual hinge line. That'll give us equal deflection both ways and just make it fly a lot better. Once that's set, do not glue it. We're just going to keep that in mind. Now, we did move our servos down, so we're going to need to push those up just by centering them again. Then I'm just going to put this in. There's only one hole depending on what servo and control horn you use, so you only have one option. I like to bring this to the outside, just so that way it lines up nicely to the control horn. What I like to do is I like to take a Sharpie, make sure it's actually working first. Gonna line it up with the hole. Now give us the exact spot it's in. It'll be hard to see on camera. You can see there's a little dot there on the control rod. Just take our pliers. Depending on which kind of bend you want to do, if you want to do a modified Z-bend or a Z-bend, whatever you like. Also, depending on what control horn you're using, just make sure to bend this middle part in to the thickness of the control horn. I usually prefer modified Z-bends, just so you can fix them at the field if you need to. And that looks pretty good. So we're going to go ahead and chop this. See, we have all this excess. We don't need half of it. As long as that looks good, we can go ahead and put the control horn on. Set it in place. That looks pretty good, so I'm going to go ahead and glue that in. Making sure we have the piece of tape to make sure it's lined up straight. And that's all we need for the ailerons. Let's go do it to the other side. Once that's done drying, we can then go ahead and open up the slots for the ailerons, just so it's easier to move mid-flight. Then once that's all done, check everything, make sure it looks good, and then test it out. Looks good. Now we can go ahead and move on to the fuselage.
So the next part is going to be our fuselage. We have all of our pieces here. It's a total of 10 pieces. All of our formers, our like box structure for the fuselage, along with all of our molded pieces. First part we're going to start off is with our formers and boxy parts.
So the first thing we're going to do with all these pieces is just kind of open up these gaps. You can use the table, especially if they're a little hard. Or you can go back, take your knife and just slightly open it up. It's best to use a ruler, but if you already cut it, it's pretty easy. This way I found is just open it up kind of like that, take it off sideways, leaves it very clean. In this case, this is going to be a B fold going to the side of it. Now make sure you have your square, or in this case a roll of tape. You like to put the glue on the surface where it'll give it the strongest joint and not just the paper. Might get a little on the table, but sometimes I don't mind, you shouldn't mind that. It just means you have glue everywhere. Now this is actually our power pod. We're going to go ahead and do the same thing to that. Most of you probably know how to do this if you're going to build this, but I'll show you how to do it anyway. And then here's our power pod actually. This is the other one I used. Just uses standard flight test firewall. Now I will say it's a little tight in the battery bay, so we're going to have to try and push our ESC down as much as possible to the roof, because the power pod is going to be inverted upside down, and the battery is going to slide right here on top of this. So we can't really have the ESC be too high or else it'll get in the way. Because usually you want the barbecue skewers to go right across flat like that in the middle, where it'll be super strong for the strength of the power pod. but we'll get to that a little later down the line as well. Now for this power pod, there's going to be no thrust angle, so just keep in mind if you're switching fire or power pods with other FT models and everything, just be aware of your thrust angle. So once that's all done, you can set the power pod aside, grab our formers. Now a lot of these formers look the same, but there's a few couple things about them. The A former obviously has no cutoff bottom or a little hole in the top here. As long as you have them labeled, you should be fine. We're going to actually glue B and C together, and we're going to leave A alone. So usually I like to keep the letters on the outside so you can always see them at all the times. Once that's done, we're going to set that to the side. We're going to take our A former, and usually most of the times these have etch marks on the side to make sure they're vertical and up and down, but because the formers go all the way to the front of the box, we can just set the box inside this. Might be a little snug, but then we already know as long as we're pushing both of them flat to the table, it's going to be 90 degrees to each other. But we're only going to put the one former on. This way I found is just to put glue along the outside. Don't put too much because you don't really need it, and if it drops, gets in your table, then gets on the outside of your model, just will affect the looks. Usually like to have the A pointed to the outside, so I usually put it against the table and just kind of drop it in place. Make sure you're setting it in at the top. And when I'm pushing this, I'm pushing kind of like at that angle, so that way I know that the box is all the way to the top of the former and still being forced at the table to make sure that former is 90 degrees. Make sure to smear it just so it has a strong bond. Once that's done, we can go ahead and move on to our molded pieces section. We don't need to glue these on yet because we're going to use the molded piece to make sure they're lined up straight, and the molded piece will give it, we'll make it, it'll kind of, you'll see going forward, but it'll make sure it's in the right position. So the first thing we want to do is make sure if all of the pieces prepped to be glued on. Whip off any excess glue. This is the main piece we're going to start with. Now I will say, if you already cut the piece, it might be too late, but the A6M model did not have these little exhaust ports. So if you just want to connect the dots here and make it connected, it'll give you the earlier model and you don't have to do the exhausts. So, but I personally like the look of this, so that's why I did that. Now we're not going to peel the paper off the actual engine exhaust flaps. We're just going to peel off the majority of it. Just be careful to not actually pull it off. Now I messed up cutting slightly, so I have these little tiny parts here. It won't affect it too much if you accidentally do this. No one's going to see it anyway, it's going to be inside the plane. Now when we're molding this, just be careful because this is not going to want to mold. It's going to want to crinkle. So just be very light when you're doing this. And just kind of put more pressure on where the actual crease lines are between the pieces. And also when you're doing this, put more of the pressure towards the front edge, just so it has less likely of crinkling. reason we don't take out the paper off those exhausts, just because it makes it easier to open it up. Because if we took the paper off, these would kind of crinkle as they're going out for the top of the paper. So it just makes it stronger when we actually open them up. As you can see here, all the budging is right where the creases are. And that's what we want to see. Just so we know that all the stress is going right to that point. See there, it looks pretty good. Depending on which kind of tape you use a thicker piece and get across the whole piece. But like for example, on this smaller piece, we don't need the bigger piece. We can use a smaller piece to get full coverage. First thing we're going to do though is just slightly crack these open. Not 90 degrees or anything, but just slightly so we know they'll actually open. Make sure the tape's covering most of the piece across. This piece is probably the weirdest piece to mold. Doesn't mean it's hard, it's just weird when you're doing it because of the pieces. You can see it just makes these a little more solid lines for those exhausts. You might get a rip or two here or there, but when it's actually glued, it'll be much easier to work with. But once we have that, we can go ahead and glue it. Just test fit how you're going to do it, how you're going to hold your fingers for it. Most of the time with these molded or Master Series style planes, it's just a matter of how you use your hands to get the piece to not crinkle and where you're putting all the pressure. Always be careful of the glue dripping, and if you can put your piece on in a way when you come together like that, so that way the glue doesn't get on the outside of the plane, it'll just make it look better. Don't forget to smear it on the inside. Once it's in place, you can leave it like this, but if you leave it in the actual shape that it's going to glue, roughly, it should be roughly a perfect circle, it'll help the glue joint be a lot cleaner at the bottom. Once that's drying, we're going to go ahead and do our other pieces. This one, you actually need to add a slight bevel to the back. Make sure you have a really sharp knife, just going to make it very easy to put on once you're done. As you can see, it's not really a crazy bevel, just enough where we know we won't have to take off more, but we know we didn't take off too little. As you can see here on the angle, there's not much of an angle there, and it's got to be about that much of an angle to the piece. So, mold it. Now, especially with hand cutting, you can tend to cut a piece slightly smaller than it should be, or a little more than it should be. So we're not going to glue this right now, just so we know it actually fits in the long run. We'll just go ahead and put tape on it so it holds its shape easier. I'm going to do the same thing to all the other pieces, except this piece. Now as we get down to these smaller pieces, we're going to add a slightly bigger bevel just because the angle is going to be a lot more for when we put it on. Just keep it consistent. Now for this piece, the way I'm going to bevel it is almost to the point of where we cut it on the other side. So you'll see here at the angle I'm going, it's generally steep, but it's practically where the corner of the foam is there. Doesn't need to be perfect, but that's about the angle we're going for. Now for this one I'm not even going to tape, just because taping it actually sort of risks crinkling it even more. So usually, I mean it's even past where it needs to go anyway, so I just usually like to leave these ones as they are. Lastly, for this big piece, we're going to take off all the paper on the other side, but just be careful and make sure that you have all the little dash line cuts here. Depending on if the camera can see it or not, I went in and put little tiny cuts here and there. And I didn't do like straight down, go in, cut, skip a little bit, go in, cut. I literally just went on top of the surface with a ruler and like poked it back and forth. With the scrap dihedral gauge, the way I did it is literally just about like that, like about every 1/8 of an inch, just so it's easier to cut. And the way we're going to do this is we're not going to cut it right now, but when we actually glue it on and have everything done, and it's actually glued to the wing, then we're going to go ahead and open this up. So now we can go ahead and take off the back. That looks pretty good. This one's just a simple molding, nothing too crazy. Make sure your hands are evenly across the whole piece. Now for this one I can't really hold because the only place it's going to connect is right here, and that would just rip it and look bad if it happens. So all I'm going to do is just put 2 pieces of tape going across it. And go ahead and put this off to the side. Then we're going to bring back this A piece. Then we're going to grab our engine flap piece. Go ahead and just kind of put this in like that. Now depending on how you marked your pieces, you notice the center is right here. Put a little dot on the top. Put it in the back as well. Same thing for this piece as well. I'll put a little dot where the center is on the inside, and then go back with the foam or more, just so it's easier to line up when we're looking at it like this on the inside. Just dry fit it first. Just be careful not putting any pressure on those engine flaps in case they swing open. When we're doing this, we're just going to make sure that that front part is flat. And if you actually want to, go ahead and put your power pod in, just so we know it's straight and it will actually fit. In this case, it didn't really fit too well. Now put it to make sure it's upright, and it's about as far down as it can be. And then we can see how much space there is. You can see it looks a little off, but that's the way it is. Then what I'm doing is kind of like pinching the sides so that bottom part comes down. We can kind of hold it down as well. That's the way we're going to glue that as well. Put this one back in. Best way to do this, make it clean, is by putting the glue on the molded piece around the inner ring. Start kind of at this angle so you can make a full revolution. Actually, make sure you don't get glue on the bottom part here, because we're not going to need that. Forgot to mention that. Then just do the same thing as before. You notice it'll be slightly easier this time. Push it all the way down. Bring it back up and check it for a second. So you can see here, I don't need that glue there. So I'm going to let it dry and then take it away, because it'll be a lot cleaner. Once that's pretty good, I'm still going to keep the power pod in there, just so it doesn't lose its shape. Grab our molded piece that goes in front of it. It's one of this size. And now, we didn't glue this one, so we can't put it on yet. But just line it up with the center tick mark at the top. And just kind of hold it in place. And make sure everything looks like it's about the right size. It's not too big or too tiny. If it's too tiny, you might need to cut another piece. This one, if you want to be really precise, take a piece of tape, put it at the top. You can put as many pieces of tape in around that side as you want. And this one actually looks a little large. And because we didn't glue it, we can go back and trim this. Now this one is so minor that it's almost not even able to be seen. You can see here I'm taking it to the table edge just so I can wrap around the table. Now because this is a circle piece, you can do this and only do one side, but I'm literally just taking about a 32nd of an inch, and I'm just going to trim that. If you see one piece that's like very flat here, I'm just going to push it out so it's a little more molded. And that actually looks pretty good from that little trim. Along with the bevel, it looks good. Once you're satisfied, If you have to cut a new piece, it's not the end of the world. Luckily, it's just foam board. Once we know it fits well. This piece is a little tricky because they're very flat to each other, but there is a slight angle to them. But usually the way you do it is you put the glue on the smaller piece, so when you put it on, there's less likely of glue smearing out everywhere. But when they're 90 degrees to each other, almost, it's very difficult. But just put glue, not right on the edge, just in case when you put it down it's a little weird. Line it up with the top first. Watch it as it comes down. Now if glue does smear on the outside, I recommend do not smear it the second you see it. Usually let it dry for a second, and then you can take it off much cleaner. I'll try and show you what I'm talking about. Actually, this one came out pretty clean. I'm going to have to show you the next piece. But that actually looks pretty good. You can see from the top, there's not much of an angle there. There's a slight angle, but you can see from the top view, there's going to be a slight angle from the side and from the bottom going up. That's because the top is actually at a slight angle for this piece, but the bottom is completely flat. Zero has a very round engine cowling. I'll try to capture all the angles by adding a little bit extra pieces so you can get that iconic shape. Now for this one, we sort of have to take off the tape, or at least just bring it down slightly, just to there. What you can also do is just take your knife, but be very careful not to go through the foam board. Just cut that little lip. That we don't have to worry about it going on the top sheet. Same thing with the next piece. Now for this one, the bottom ring of the tape is way too big for this piece. So just be very careful if you do this. You can either test it without the tape on, like this, and just go around, or you can leave the tape on and trim it to the size of the piece. If you do that, it's easier to actually line up the piece when it comes to glue it, and you can see the glue line and the mold and everything. But for this one, it's actually a little bit large too, so I'm going to go ahead and trim this as well. That piece actually looks pretty good. Go ahead and tape it together first. Now this is going to be a lot smaller of a glue joint here, so we can actually give this a little less glue time to dry. It might be easier just to take the tape off for gluing it. But here's what I was talking about before. If you just be very careful and always put the pressure right where the X-Acto blade is going to be pushing. But if you trim this outside, it'll just make it easier to make a strong glue joint for the seam here, and then also you can tell how the crease lines are on the outside of your piece. Now this one, because it doesn't have a form on the inside, you'll see a little bit of white here. You can kind of just push that in with your finger to make it fit. Once that's done, we're going to put the glue on this piece. And just be careful of your fingers, because they're so close to the glue on this one. So yeah, for this one I got a little bit of glue on the outside, but I'm not going to go ahead and smear that. For that one I can, but... Now if the glue coming out the side is really big, you might want to try and get it off. If it's just big enough where it doesn't really touch a lot of the piece beneath it, it'll be easier to let it wait and then take it off. Now you can see it's starting to get that shape. So yeah, for this part here, you kind of just take your fingernails. This one went a little lower than I thought it would be. Usually you just pick them off, but in this one, kind of just take your razor blade, just slowly saw and cut it away. Now don't try and power through it, or else you might slice your blade away. Just be slow with it, then it'll come off very easily. And oftentimes these ones aren't even really bonded to the foam board, so they can come off with ease. For this one we can actually take out the tape, just because it's so tiny. Just always pull parallel to the actual line of the where it comes together, just so you don't peel the paper off. Finally test that final piece. This one's a little bit extra. See them off by a little bit. Just keep in mind that I'm trying to do these not necessarily as fast as possible, but I'm trying to do them where I can get them out to the community, but also have school to deal with. So I try to be perfect, but perfection is the enemy of completion. So, same thing, I can't cut that over here. Now I went a little much on the inside part here. What I can do is kind of take my left hand and push this down just slightly, because you're not going to notice that when it's flying by in the air. It might have a little bit of a weird angle to it, but it should be fine. With this last one too, you can kind of make sure it's a perfect circle. There's a slight ovalish shape going this way, so you can kind of just hold it in a way that will fix that when you glue it. You want to be as scale as possible. Once that looks good. For this one, we can actually go ahead and put the glue on this one, just because it's very difficult with this piece, especially if you pick it up and your fingers go like that. There's a good chance you're going to get glue on it, and especially by the angle at which this piece is on, it's easier to just go ahead and put the glue on here. Just don't put it too close to the edge, or if you do put it on the edge, put a little bit amount of glue, just so it doesn't overflow when you put the piece on. You don't want to put it too low because the angle of the foam was cut. it won't really get any good traction on the glue when you put it on. Or this piece right here won't really be attached. It's hard to put pressure on this piece just because if you put too much it's going to crinkle. You do push, kind of push at a slight angle that way, or that way, whichever way it is. Once that's done drying, you can see we have that iconic zero shape of the cowling. The only thing that would make this more scale is these little gun. Yes, you call them holes, but they're meant for getting the gun shot through the cowling. Just makes it a little easier for manufacturing, I guess. Now I recommend holding off on that just yet because the guns are going to be on the actual canopy, and if you're going to line that up, make sure you put the canopy on first so you know exactly where it should be lined up. Once that's done, we can pretty much take off all these tape pieces except this big one here, because right now we have to put in this piece. Make sure B is facing the table, C is facing towards you, and we're just going to test fit this one first. A little tricky getting these on. This is going to go flat with the table as well. And you kind of just line this up to where it sees fit. And then without putting pressure on this part, hold it kind of on the sides and go down. See, one of them went in. See why the other one doesn't go in? Find out why. There we go. And this actually looks pretty good. But we actually can't really glue the molded piece to it because we have all these engine flaps. We can only really glue it at the top here where the guns are. We also don't want to get in the way of the guns. And this is going to be where our canopy stays in place. It's just going to keep it from flying up and out. Here's where the batteries are going to go, and there's no former even glued on anyway. So what we're going to do is carefully take this out. Then we're going to glue this to the box bar, not the molded piece. Put glue all along each side, and that C4 is going to rest flat against all these. After you test fit, it should go in relatively easily. Make sure it's pushed flat down on the top here. It's kind of hard to get a grip of this, but kind of use this hole and push it together. Now we can also push this down. Give it a quick table test without putting pressure on these pieces. And then go back to holding it. Make sure it's generally clocked with this top part. These little slots are for the guns here, and this part right here is just in between the guns, I guess, but make sure that this corner and this corner here are lined up with these high points here. That'll help us know which is exactly center, because we have our center point on this piece and not on this piece. Once that's done, we can go ahead and take off the tape here. Depending on how that comes out, we can go ahead and put more glue on that or not. This one looks pretty good. All of our strength has come from the inside here. Now what we're going to do is go ahead and just test fit this piece on. We're going to watch the top here. And then what we're looking for here is this part here of this etched reference line and this reference line to line up with the beginning part of the engine flaps here, and also the ending of these gun slots, just right in between them. Even if it's not perfect, just find the balance. Check the bottom too. We're not actually going to put any glue on the bottom here because there's nothing to glue it to. Go ahead and take out this tape. And we can actually just kind of hold this. We can take this back part and tape it relatively close together like that. And put this on here. What we're looking for is this bottom part to line up with the bottom of these formers here. And that's actually almost how the shape will be, so one last test fit. Now what I'm going to do is mark where the right there where the bottom of this former is. The bottom of this former is just roughly. That way we can see where we should put the glue. And then when we're going to do this, we're not going to put any glue along here on the inside because there's nothing to glue it to, and that's where our hatch is going to be. So we're going to use those reference lines, reference marks. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and reference from the bottom where the cockpit is, or where the hatch is, just so I know not to go in that area. Just be careful sliding this on. And put any piece of tape I can find. In this case, a pretty large piece on top. Just so I know that's straight. Come down to the bottom here. Don't worry about smearing this because it's not our main priority. We're looking for these bottom little flare out parts to line up with the bottom of the former B/C. In this case, B. Then we're just going to hold that there, applying even pressure everywhere. Just constantly look at your sides, make sure they're straight. Now these little bottom parts won't actually stick down to be right up against former B there, but that's okay because when I put the wing on, it'll all help it. Just going to open this back one up slightly. Take out this top piece of tape. That looks pretty good. We're not going to open up this top part just yet. This we need to put on the back section. That's actually what we're going to go ahead and do now. Our fuselage section is done. We're ready to move on to tail section.
So the next part we're going to do is do the tail section. It's pretty simple. It's only about, I guess, 7 pieces. The next first thing we're going to start off with is these deform pieces along with this strange angle piece. This is going to be for our formers and everything, or for our servos that get glued onto. So we can go ahead and set these other pieces aside. And all we're going to do with this is just glue our 2 formers together like this.
What I'm going to do for this one is just poke 2 holes where the coffee stirrers will go through for our servos, just so I know where their holes are, so I'm not going to glue them when I glue them together. Flatten them a little bit. Once that's done, we can go ahead and finish the holes. Poke through the other one. If you want to make it look really clean, kind of push the paper back down into the hole. Just poke it through again. That way the paper isn't spewing out of the hole. Next we can take this shape here, this piece, stick it in to the deformer. Make sure this is 90 degrees. It doesn't really have to be, but it always helps. Put it against two thicknesses of foam. In this case I'm just using the rudder. That way we could take our 90 degree tool, making sure it's 90 degrees. Set this off to the side now. Next what we're going to do is go ahead and prep the tail pieces. Go ahead and open this up with a ruler. And take it to the edge of the table. Now again, depending on how much deflection you want, the more you can bevel. The Zero doesn't need too much angle because it's such a big elevator. The Zero had crazy big control surfaces on basically everything, which is one of the reasons it was so maneuverable. Looks pretty even. Do the same thing to the rudder now. With this one, I actually need a little tiny second bevel at the top here, just so the top doesn't run, the counterbalance doesn't run into the top of the rudder. See there, that looks good. I'm just going to fix this now by taking our push rod. Just choose a side that's your favorite. Usually try to push down in a way that it won't really crinkle the foam or paper right on this bend. Should be pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and do the glue trick. Having a scrap piece of foam ready. Just get ready to smear it. Let that dry to the other one. Now because it's such a big surface, just be careful, move quick. can go ahead and put these pieces off to the side for a second. Like this little piece, just leave it with the rudder. Now we can worry about this, about probably the most challenging part of the build, this tail piece. Just requires the most molding and the tightest molding, most likely you've probably ever done. Because you can see here on the Zero, it is very, very tiny back here, wherever the molded piece is. It gets almost about a width of foam. And what we have to do is we have to mold the top section very tight and the bottom section very tight. So that way it gets a really cool... Because the reason I did that is because there's a very, very iconic point on the back here that if you leave out, it kind of ruins the look of the plane. Because there's so many like pointy angles of the plane. And that's just one of them that you'll see. And it's almost like you know instantly it's a Zero. Always start off with peeling off the paper. Now make sure before you start molding this that you have all those dash cut lines again. Also have a little cut into each of the holes for our coffee stirrers. And now before we do the technique to get a crazy mold, we're just going to start off by normally molding it as we would any other piece. Just applying even pressure in all spaces. Really try and put a lot of pressure on this back section, just because if we put it under a lot of stress now, it's going to be easier to make it mold how we want it to later. As you see there, it's not too much, but the piece has been molded a lot and is willing to move for us. Just kind of see how far. Especially on this piece, always be aware of how your hands are pressing the piece to mold it, because if you press it all up here, odds are it's going to crinkle at the back. Same thing with here, if you crinkle it. If you do it back here, it's going to crinkle the front. Now there's a certain way to getting really, really tight curves. And again, it depends on how your hands are placed. But what we're going to try and do is kind of take the piece up like this. And what we're looking for is kind of like to bend on where these dashed lines are. And just sort of ease it in, kind of in half. And slowly like rock it back and forth. Apply like most of your pressure and attention to this back section, because it's the easiest place to crease. And take as much time as you want on this. But just slowly keep feeding this little angle into it in motion. Now we're not looking for a perfect molded piece. We're looking for this back tail section to be willing to go to the other side about like that, so we can glue it together. Just over time keep putting a little more pressure. The more spaced out and even you can make the pressure, the less likely it will crease. See here, I got a slight crease here. Just because I wasn't paying attention to the front, I was more paying attention to the back. Just to pay attention to the whole piece. The longer you take, the easier it'll be to glue it. And once that's done, you can see it's not actually really the shape of the Zero, but it has a crease that's almost 90 degrees to the one part here. And it's going to be easier to curve it to the other side so we can glue it, and then put tape on it, crush it down, and it'll give the iconic pointy shape of the tail. Do the same thing to the other side. It's going to be a little more challenging just because the other piece is already molded. Just putting our hand in the right spot. Try to stay away from using your fingertips like this, just because it adds all the pressure to one spot. But if you have to do it, just be careful. Make sure all the pressure is even. We're almost looking for this piece to just fold in on itself. I haven't tried it, but if you put a large weight on this and just leave it overnight or something, I can imagine it would do the same effect. But I'm going to stick with using my hands for this piece. Before we go ahead and tape it together though, just do the other side for one quick second. So you can see here it's basically going to come together on its own. See, I got a crinkle there just because I had my fingers in the wrong places. We're kind of going to work our way back. We're going to start at the front and move our way back to taping this. Now for this part, it helps having bigger pieces of tape, except at the tail we're going to want to use tiny or small pieces of tape. I'm actually sort of going to do a combination, because if you see a crinkle, I usually try to keep the crinkle showing, just so that way you know if you're putting too much stress on one spot or not. It's a little challenging to hold it while it's also doing this. Just apply even pressure back here. Usually like to tape it up here. Tape it with one of them in the back. It's a little off. Maybe change it slightly. I'm trying to line this up so that these two marks are touching at the top here. And from here we can kind of start to really mold it and put it together. As you can see here, it's not together here, but it is together here. It usually means not necessarily that something's creasing, but it's definitely at a higher risk of creasing. It's going to be a little frustrating with all the tape coming back and forth and on and on. Just take your time with this part. And once you put this piece on for tape, don't let go of it. Put pressure down here so at the bottom will stay together and it won't just rip that piece of tape there. But usually I'll try to do one piece of tape and then skip this one piece. Go to the piece below it. Tape that one. Doesn't have to be perfect. Then tape the one above it. And then do the one below that one. I'm actually going to take these off for a second. And just really be careful. Hand placement is key. Even if it's not perfect, it's just getting it to keep that shape. See there, I did this one. I'm going to open up this one. Push this down a little more. Then from here, you really just kind of make sure that this back section is ready to come in on itself. Well, this is really the most challenging part, and it's okay if you have a crinkle. We just kind of slowly ease into it. We really can only use our fingertips, so that's why you have to be very careful. We just kind of slowly ease it into its shape. And from here we can take a piece of tape that we left. I'm going to put it almost right up to it. I should take this one off. I'm going to redo this one. So you see here, there's a slight crinkle here. But luckily all this is going to be like under the rudder and elevator. So you'll barely even see it anyway. And as I'm putting this tape on, I'm just trying to put as much pressure as this back part here, just so it stays together. And the more patient you are and willing to work with it, the better it'll come out in the long run. This is the hardest part back here, just because it's the most stressful, not only for you but also the piece. As you can see there's a slight gap, but that's okay, because as this piece holds this, it'll hold its shape and get to know the piece. And I'm not going to do it right now, but if we were to crush this like this, you'll see that this piece will actually start to look like the point on the back. And instead of being like this, it's going to go like this. So now we'll say if you want to leave this overnight, it will help the actual process of gluing it. But if you're in a time crunch, it's not the end of the world, it's just going to be a little more difficult. But the way we're going to glue this is we're going to glue this in stages. And we're kind of going to start at the top, make our way back. And we're going to kind of do, we can do longer increments up here, but as we get back here, we're going to go smaller and smaller glue joints. Just because we want the one crease to be good, the next one to be clean. So I'm going to open up these two top ones. And something too is by using a smaller glue joint here, we're not going to get as much glue as we can in here, but it's going to be a lot stronger here over a wide area. Now there will be some glue spilling out, but I would rather have some glue on the outside of the plane than totally fall apart midair and open up and ruin the tail section. So you can also sort of put glue on the inside if you can. I'll have a scrap piece of foam ready. Open it up as much as you can, but not to where it's too stressful on the plane. Just go as far back. There will be some glue spilling out. Hold it down for a second like this. Smear some glue. Once that's like that, put it together. Put some tape on the top. Same thing for this part. The nice thing is, from the glue spilling out, although it might not look the best, you'll know that the whole connection there is super strong. once it seems dry. I think it is. Go ahead and just actually press down on this just as much as I can, evenly. Make sure it all comes back together. What I'm actually going to do from here is slightly put it on its side and push it downward just ever so slightly, where the foam will kind of angle itself almost like a bevel, but without even beveling it. Just so that when we glue it, it'll be easier when it's all flat. Don't push down too hard, because we don't want a giant crinkle. As you can see, this back hole here, I'm pushing down about that hard for reference. Roll it if you want. Because ultimately we have to get it to this shape in the end. So. Actually, we can go ahead and take off these back pieces of tape, or leave them on the piece. Just unravel them. Be careful with the sprout open. Put some pressure right here, or wherever you put the last piece of tape for when you open this up, just so it doesn't spring open and crease it. But for this one, we're going to go to about right here with the glue. It's kind of a balance of trying to open up this like kind of like a flower, but also not too much where we're going to crink it about here. So just kind of like however you do this, just know where your tape is. You can always be mindful of where your hands are going to go for when you glue it. I'm actually going to tape the back section first, this front section. Taped on the one. Try to be quick with this. Taped on the back one first, then taped on the front one. I'm going to go ahead and tape this one on the back. Doesn't need to be absolutely perfect. Open up this one again. Careful of ripping the tape. Put it back on. Now I might just hold this one with our hands. This is one of those ones that we can't really smear it later. As you can see from that, it's a little messy, but I'd rather have it do this than open mid-flight. While that's drying, I'm going to put a new piece of tape on. And this will actually be pretty pointy here, so even if it's kind of got like a small angle to it, should be fine. Now we can do the most challenging part, this back section. Just do one last test fit or dry fit just to make sure Just remember there's going to be glue here this time, so you can kind of pinch this here. We're only going to do about to here. You could probably smear it. And take this piece and wrap it around like that. Now we do this last part. But we're going to leave these pieces of tape on just so it holds its shape. We're going to give it a second or two to dry. Then once this is all dry, then we can kind of slowly start to rock it ever so slightly just to get the actual shape it'll be. See, here it's starting to be more of a circle. We can actually sort of test this by putting the deformer in the back here. Okay, so I had a little trouble putting the deformer into the large molded piece here. It was just a little tight. So what I did, now I'm not left-handed and I've already did this, but I put a lot of pressure along this inside edge and just kind of crush it down, making a full revolution around it. That way it was a little easier to go in. You can see here that it fits in very easily. It's easier to make sure it's clocked in straight. And just overall easier to glue. You don't even have to have it, you just have a round surface like this. So, we can actually leave this in here for what we're going to do next. We're kind of going to use this as a guide, and we're going to slightly just keep putting it back, because this part here, although there's tape on here, this part here is going to come together as one, so we need this part to kind of get lifted up a lot. So we're kind of going to keep working it to get it as high as we can. Once we feel comfortable with that, we're going to peel the tape off any of it that's covering these two holes right here. We'll go ahead and make sure we actually cut into them. Now give them about a pretty decent angle to poke into it at. One of these is for the elevator, this one will be for the elevator, the other one will be for the rudder. And then we can do is go ahead and take out this part. Now we're actually going to make our control rod pathways. What we're going to do is set two of them apart. Just take a little bit of tape. And we're going to connect them together. Just make sure they're even and actually line up with each other. Should always watch for the first roll on these ones, just so they're absolutely lined up. Because once we glue this, we really can't get back in or have any access to it. Get one done. Do the same thing the other side. Once we have that, we're going to go ahead, whichever one you'd like, poke into one side. It's going to come out the back here. Now from looking at the other model, we only need about this much to stick out. So what we're going to do is slightly angle it up, just like this, and we're going to put a little dab of glue in the back spot here. Just so we know it'll stay in place. And then go ahead and push it in just a little more. Just to about there. Just about an inch sticking out. This way we know it won't move and won't budge when we're putting it on the former here. Because the worst thing we can have happen is have this go inside of it, or have this push too far in when we're trying to glue the former on. They don't have to be even with each other, but it just might look nicer. Now on this one it's going to be a little tight, having it go straight back like this. So what I usually like to do is make it at an X, just so that way it's a little stronger and a little more of a direct pathway to the control horns. Once we have that, just remember which side's which. Stick the one into the other. You may need to have to open this up a little bit more, just because barbecue skewers are slightly smaller than the coffee stirrers. Now we're not going to use nearly as much as this coffee stirrer out here, so don't worry about having too much. We're also not even going to put the servos on yet, so just test fit this. That actually fits really well, so we can go ahead and glue this former on. Now it's going to be a little tricky with having these coffee stirrers like this. What I would like to do is just kind of set them down at the bottom here like this. And then you can kind of use gravity as your friend. But just try and do it in a way that you know that the coffee stirrers won't come up off of its spot. Once you get to this point, you can kind of just put them in between them, just to get the most area possible. And from there, it's just simple as sticking on the piece. Coffee stirrers might stick a little bit, but worry about getting the piece on first. Then if they're not straight inside, kind of pull them out. Okay, so once that's done, you're going to see that we have a nice clean tail section. What we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and put this off to the side. We're going to glue our tail section together. Take off the tape from when we made it stronger. Just give it some time to reflex back, depending on how long you left it here. Same thing on the rudder. Now this little piece is going to go in between the rudder and the elevator. This is going to add for a nice scale appearance and cool looks. But we're going to leave that off until we glue it all together, just so that way we know it doesn't get in the way of the elevator when we try to move it around and everything. We're going to take this to the table edge, notch it in, grab our 90-degree tool, and wash it, make sure it's straight. Watch it from the back and make sure that both of the sides of the elevator here are even with each other. Once that looks good, go ahead and just put glue Once that's done, I'm going to go ahead and reinforce it again. You can't put these into the actual tail section once it's all actually on the plane. But I like usually gluing these together first, just to make sure that we know it's 90 degrees. And it will just look good before we put it on. You can also see how the deflection looks. I have a little bit of rubbing here, so I'm going to go ahead and just trim that slightly. Now we can go ahead and put this little decorative piece on. This is going to go right behind the elevator, right in this little slot here. Now if you go to put this on, it doesn't really fit, or if it's rubbing up against something really tight, you can go ahead and trim it if need be. It just looks a little tight, so I'm going to go ahead and just trim this front section. Along with each side section. This is just dependent on how thick you cut, if you draw a line and if you cut right on the line, or offset the line. I try to make this piece where the actual elevator cut off on the real plane, which is right here. We also need to connect both of them, so both sides of the elevator. So yeah, you can see there, that looks pretty good, up and down. I'm actually going to take a big piece of tape, put one on each side, just to make sure it's relatively flat. And just constantly look at this piece, make sure it's not getting in the way. It's even on both sides. Once that's done drying, we can go ahead and set that off to the side. Clear off the workbench slightly. Next thing we're going to do is open up the tail section. We're going to take off all the tape on the top that is covering up these etched lines. Now we're not going to take them off, but we're just going to take off enough to where we can see these lines. Once we have that done, or if you plan to do it, go ahead and roll this slightly again. This is our last chance. Should always be mindful of finger placement and hand placement. So now that we have this glued, it's not going to move anywhere. But once that's done, we can go ahead and cut this line and all the other lines. Now for this one, we're going to want to cut it 90 degrees to the foam. Not like this or this, just straight 90 degrees. What this is going to do is it's going to sit flat along the rudder. This little part here, we're going to go in slightly at an angle. Now for this part, we're going to go at a slight angle upward, not 90 degrees. Be careful not to cut through that coffee stir there. Just be mindful going through there. Now this part's more for the rudder, so we don't have to worry about the strength of it because it's attached to the elevator. For this part, we're going to start up here, come at a pretty good angle, going downward. We're basically just cutting a bevel that we just can't really see. Try not to go too deep unless you'll hit, or else you hit this part down here. It's not the end of the world, it's just you don't want to go through the other side of it. Same thing to the other side. Once we have that done, we should be able to just pull it out. If it's not working, just kind of go back in. Trim where you think it needs to be trimmed. Where it feels like it's not budging. Kind of budge down on this piece because we're not going to even use it. Once that's done, it should be a little easier to work with. You can see now this is going to easily fold up to that very, very tiny mold here. It's going to be a lot easier to work with. From here we can kind of just do the same thing again. It should be a lot easier this time, less likely to crinkle. What we're working for up here is this to kind of come in a little bit, because this is where the rudder should be, and this has to pinch together on itself. So we have to get this relatively pretty tall so we can go ahead and do this just like that. And we're not actually going to glue the rudder in just because we can't tell if it's level with the wings or not. But if we put the rudder in, or the elevator and rudder in, just be careful of these 2 points here. That's how you know if it's ready to go in or not, is if you can get it to a place where it feels comfortable to not just slam into that and crush it. Don't forget to do the other side. There you can see it's pretty good. Then you can see here, that's about how much space we have to go. It's not going to be perfect when you try to do it, but you can kind of just pinch it with the sides and it'll pop up a little more.
And you can see here when we pinch it together, it comes along those sides pretty good. And with these coffee stirrers, you can actually kind of push them in a way that will help it.
And if you can't get it all the way up here, luckily you can kind of just trim this top part here with the blade to bring it down more. No one will notice that.
You can see here this back part here came out really nice in the sense of that it's right there with it. Now the shape on the bottom actually is kind of like a, I won't say a teardrop, but a reverse teardrop where it's thinner almost to right here, and then it sort of springs out and then goes back to normal. Like this will be relatively straight back here, like that.
Next thing we're going to do is just keep rolling this, and just keep going back and forth as long as you can. It could take you 15 minutes, it could take you 2 minutes. It just depends. Just keep rolling this back and forth to get it up as high as you can, just to where you feel comfortable, where it won't crinkle here. Because this is the most likely spot where you're going to get a crinkle. Just don't forget to do the equal amount of time for both sides. That's what will really help it be perfect.
Okay, so I let this sit overnight and everything. Obviously, we left the tape on here. After we do that, we could go ahead and take all the tape off. Make sure not to take it off the actual bottom of the skin. The last thing we want is just to rip open when we're trying to mold it. It's really helped to give it shape, make it kind of more like this and not like this.
So you can see here it's a lot easier to make it stand taller. Well, we can test that just by taking our tail section. Be careful of these little points, they're very easy to crinkle. It's actually better if you kind of like poke them out like that slightly, just to get it on. And then once it's in place, you can kind of test fit it. Now just to, when you're trying to fit this up to here, don't squeeze right at the point of the elevator. Squeeze a little behind it, or in front of it, and then you can kind of squeeze it where it's at. You can see there, it's almost there. It's harder for the camera, but you can see it's almost there. And that's an easy trim we can do, just to make it fit very easily. But once we know that works, we'll set our tail section aside. Now we don't need these coffee stirrers this long, because the elevators, or the servos are going to sit about right here. So all we have to do is just take a pair of scissors and trim them about an inch away from the foam board. There, they're a little cleaner, and less likely to move around, get on some glue joints. Next part we're going to do is go ahead and glue on this back section here. First thing we got to do is glue this little lip together on each side. I left it in the tape overnight as well too, just so it kind of has a sort of transitioning shape from thicker to thinner. This is going to come together like this. It's a very small glue joint, so I'm going to take a smaller thing of tape. Now make sure when you glue this, always watch it, because this one tends to either do this in like a V or the other way for a V. Just make sure they're nice and parallel to each other. If you want, you can kind of hold it in shape roughly as it's drying, just to make it a little easier. Once that's done drying, we can test fit our tail section on. Kind of check from the inside to see where it lines up. Sometimes there's kind of two like shoulders right here and here from the cuts in the foam board goes right there. So that might be where it's getting you some trouble. If you want to, you can kind of start off with that bottom part and then slide it in. That actually went on pretty well. Even if it's not clock straight, there's just a test fit, just to know it fits. But overall it looks pretty good. We can go ahead and glue these together. And we don't have to worry about our servos just yet, because we're going to open up this top part and do it all later. Just be careful taking it out so you don't crush this piece, because there's nothing really holding it together. Kind of just take a motion of sliding this off, not sliding this off. I'll put glue on this piece. And this is going to go a lot easier with the glue on there. And this bottom part likes to kind of slip forward. Just hold that in place. Get it in position on the top first. You can actually take a piece of tape and make sure this top part is staying together, making sure it's lined up. Then it should be easier to hold on the bottom. It's a very stressful point for that little glue joint. But luckily, because we have so much access here, we can always go in and reinforce that later. See, there's a little off there, but that's no problem. We can always just glue our tail section in a little bit of an angle. Because it all depends on how we glue our wings in first. That's why we didn't put our tail section on yet. Once that's done, we can test this area. You can see there's a slight gap, but no one's going to notice that. And then go ahead, take out this one piece in front of it. Once that's done, we're ready to go ahead and glue on our wings.
So now that we have our wings over here, first thing we're going to go ahead and do is test fit them. Now, we're going to try and feed this wire in to the power pod area inside there, just so that way it's a little bit out of the way. And the way we're going to do this is just kind of set it down. We're going to flip it upside down, and we're going to watch for this center line, and this obviously center line where these 2 points meet up back here. Once that's good, we can just kind of set it in there, and notice the clean fit. Check each side. Now the way we're going to glue this is we're going to glue it right to this molded piece, and then we're going to go back later and reinforce this with glue on the outside. Just so that way, because that's the way the glue's going to get its strength, or the wing's going to get its strength. So we have to make sure that's a really strong joint. What we're looking for here is kind of straight on, the wings are level with that power pod. That's the easiest way to tell. Because once we have it lined up with the bottom, we can then flip it over, come down here, come to the table edge, and make sure everything's level. Now the way we're going to do this is we're going to glue here and here. We're not going to glue this thing yet. This is going to hold our servos in place. It's a little wobbly, and what we like to do is, once we have it all glued and we have the top section open, we can go ahead and glue this back down, so that way it's very strong and where we want it to, and not accidentally at an angle very far sideways or anything. It won't affect anything. It won't affect anything like that, but it'll make we look weird with your servos there. But dry fit it one more time. It's probably the most important step. Just be careful. Take your time with it. Sometimes this little back part back here likes to pop up, so you can kind of just push it up with your fingers. Just kind of take mental notes of where gaps are, if there are any, and all that stuff. Okay. Once you think you're ready, and you can do that as many times as you want, go back and put some glue on all the surfaces. Just not the part in the middle. Don't worry too much about excess glue on the outside, just because we're not only going to put the glue on the outside to reinforce it, but we're also going to put our wing fairings there. So any like major glue globbage is going to be covered up anyway. Don't forget to feed that wire harness. Set those wings down. Get ready to go by the table edge. Once you have them lined up straight, bring it down to the ground. It actually looks pretty level. And I usually like to hold my hands on the plane just so I know I'm getting all the areas. If your wings are a little tilted, it won't affect the flying performance too much, but just make sure you glue your tail ends parallel to your wings. Now because it's your wings, just give it a good time to dry. Once that's done, we can sort of like test the strength of it by just flying around like a little model again. But if you need to make airplane noises to make it seem real, you must. Once that's done, we can go ahead and put our tail section on. Dry fit it one more time. Tail section is probably going to be the most tricky to glue in because of all of its little angles and everything.
first thing we can do is this back section here. It's kind of going to be almost a point in a sense of where we can just put straight glue here to keep it together. I'm going to grab a piece of tape, just about, actually, it's about enough glue to there, so we can push it together. And now the glue is actually going to melt the foam a little bit, and this is actually kind of what we want, because the closer we can get this back point to the width of foam, the cooler it'll look on that point. Now I'm actually going to hold this just because I don't trust the tape holding this together. And by pushing with your hands, you kind of always have to give it pressure, compressing this foam, giving that point the exact shape, or the width of foam here. Because depending on how well this camera picks it up, the shape here is about the width of foam from this point of paper to the other point of paper. As you can see here, it kind of comes together and then flattens out. Just like that, flattens out. This is because right behind right underneath the rudder here, there's this piece on the elevator. That's kind of right where we want it to start to go together. Now the shape actually kind of has sort of a oval, so I'm kind of trying to compress the top more than just the middle. I'm focusing all my pressure on the top actually. Once you get to the back, you can kind of sort of flatten it together, but you can see here, I'll put a piece of foam next to this just to give you an idea. But that's about almost the width of foam. So this will also sort of help this bottom part for the elevator to sort of come together to raise this point up even more. This is the hardest part of the whole build, just making sure it lines up with it. Even if it doesn't, it's okay. It's just that's the hardest part of the build. So we can go ahead and slide this part in. Just make sure it stays together. We can actually add a piece of tape over the top of it. That's a pretty good shape there from the back. Now, the way we're going to glue this is we're going to kind of hold this part here, and then we're going to pinch this together here, because this is going to make it a lot easier by compressing it out here.
Now the way we're going to do this is we're going to flip it upside down and just put glue all on both sides here. Flip it over again, quickly put some glue on here and here, and then we're going to slide it together. Now, don't be too slow with this or you might have the glue drop everywhere. Just be careful.
Try and do this and wait for the camera. Let's let the glue drop up for a second. If you let gravity be your friend and let the glue get up top, it's less likely it's going to fall down on the table underneath. Now these glue joints aren't really structural that we're doing right now. These are just more for decorative in the sense of that it'll make it look nice. So you got a lot of glue on the top here. And tape the back rudder section. Hold it at the middle. No, it's straight in the back, so I don't have to worry about that. And press it. Press this together. Now, this is your first time doing a Master Series plane or any type of style of this. Don't worry too much about this little hump of the rudder, just because we can always trim it. And even if it didn't have a good joint here, we can always come back later and put glue on the outside. It might not look the prettiest, but again, this isn't a structural point. So now, as you can see there, it might be the most ugly part for your plane crinkle-wise, but you're not going to be able to see this when it's flying by, doing a roll, instead of being shot down by a Wildcat or a Hellcat. Now, depending on how picky you are, I have a slight gap here, but personally I think I'd rather have, because don't forget, we're going to have all the glue on the bottom here, so it's going to be super strong down here. So I'm going to go ahead and leave this be, but if you feel you need to put glue there, go ahead. Just depends on how picky you are with glue over looks. But from here, make sure you have a really sharp blade, because you can see I'm a little short on here. So just kind of take some practice. I'm like, start from where it actually lines up with the molded piece. Again, make sure you have a sharp knife for this. Just kind of slowly angle it into the piece. Make sure you're flat, not cutting at an angle. Then you can't even tell, and it looks still really good. So next thing we can do is go ahead and glue on the bottom of the elevator.
So before we go ahead and glue on our tail section with the glue, we can actually go ahead and remove some tape just so it doesn't get in our way. Now for this piece of tape that we left on for making this pointy section, the elevator can still sort of pop up. So what we're going to do is first find a little gap. This piece connected together makes it a little more difficult. So I'm just going to take a X-Acto blade. Don't cut into your plane. Then open it up to both sides. Once you kind of have both of them, you kind of just tear it slightly. Now it's tape free. So that's now you can kind of see the lines of the Zero really starting to take shape, especially with the tail on now. From here we can go ahead and check our alignment of how level the wings are with the elevator. You can see this one's a little off. It's angling a little downward this way. So we're going to go ahead and do is we can kind of just put some pressure on one side, line it up to make sure it's level. The nice thing is, because we glue the elevator and rudder together first, it kind of moves that rudder slightly, just so it's a little more aligned and looks super straight. Whichever side is lower, you usually tend to do the side first. In this case, this side is lower, so I'm going to do this one first. And we already know it's lined up straight because this back rudder piece lines up with the fuselage piece. So depending on how sensitive your hands are to glue. Keep your hands away, because we're going to smear this one. Now because this is right by the control surfaces for the elevator, I'm not going to swipe towards the elevator, but I'm going to swipe away from it, so that way there's less likely of glue eating on the hinge and gluing it together for some reason. Once that's there, make sure to always watch your joint. Make sure it's level with the wings. And give this glue drying time more time than you think, just in case it decides to just go back and randomly come undone. So one side's done, we can go ahead and do the other side. Once we have our elevator and wings lined up, we can go ahead and glue the back pointy section done, or all together. Easiest way to do this is just to kind of smear glue on the side of it. The elevators, or this pointy part here is kind of like shut in. This part right here. So we can kind of just put glue along the section of the rudder / elevator right here. Do the same thing on the other side. I'm going to go ahead and just kind of try and push this to the side as much as possible. You can kind of choose a side. If you have more crinkles on one side than you do the other, in this case I have a little more on this side, I'm going to push to the other side just because I usually like to pick a side that looks the best. Push it slightly over, put some glue in there, close it back up, smear up any glue. I'm actually going to hold this together. Just be careful of your fingers. Just because if we push it together, it's really going to adapt to the width of foam board, going from 2 thicknesses of foam to 1. If you ever look at the back of a Zero too, it has a very iconic like oval shape underneath the rudder and elevator. Try to capture as much as I can. They did a pretty good job, but and from here we basically have our outlines of a Zero. See from the side view, just has a nice all the way to the point. The next thing we're ready to do is go ahead and open up our cockpit actually, and go ahead and install our servos.
Now when we're doing this, we have the cockpit that we have to worry about. So we're not going to cut 90 degrees of the foam. We're going to cut straight up and down, just so that way we know when we put the other pieces in for the cockpit, it'll work. Just be careful with this. Even if it's not 90 degrees, or if it's straight up and down, you can always go back later and trim it. Right there, messed up. The dash cuts that we cut before are definitely going to help us when we're trying to do this. You can use sort of a sawing action if you need to. pop it off with your razor a little bit. Open it up. And we don't need this piece anymore, but I'm just going to set it to the side. From here you can kind of tell how straight you were up and down. We don't have to worry too much about back here. More of just where this front part is, for where the guns are going to be. Overall it looks pretty good, but I'm just going to slightly trim off any spots that I think are a little too far over. Make sure you have a really sharp blade for this too. As you can see there, we have a lot of access to our cockpit and our all of our inside internals and everything. Now from here we can actually go ahead and glue this piece that comes out from former D. There's no good way to do this, but there's also no bad way to do this. All you have to do is just kind of drop it, angle it to the side slightly, watch the middle of the wing, and just dribble some glue into the bottom. Doesn't need to be a lot. And just kind of line it where it should be. Just because I'm trying to save weight, I'm just going to wipe away some foam. It'll be a little hard getting to this one. Or wipe away some glue. So now from here, we can go ahead, take out our Y harness, just kind of open it up a little bit. Next thing we're going to do is go ahead and glue in our servos. So let's go ahead and get our servos. So if we're gluing our servos in, we're going to obviously our two servos, two control horns. We make sure our servos are centered and everything. We also need our two control rods. Now I already I already made sure everything was all right, and I scuffed the back of them, just like the same thing with the servo or with the ailerons and the servos. I made sure to use the longest arm for both of the control horns, just so that way, because the rudder needs a lot of throw, and so does the elevator. But I just used the longest of the four of them there. Same process. Make sure they're all centered. Then what we're going to do is we're going to glue these as far forward as we can on this arm here. But before we do that, we're going to go ahead and put our control rods in. Doesn't really matter top or bottom. Go ahead and feed the one in. Put rifle where it should be. Another one. Once they're roughly in place, we can go ahead and actually glue them down. Make sure none of the wires are getting in the way. The black part of the top of the servo should rest with the top of the piece of foam board. What this does is it puts it right in line with the motor, so it'll roll more streamlined and axial. Nice thing about having these servos more far forward is it puts less, make the plane feel lighter in the sense that the servos are more on the center of gravity, or at least closer to it. This is done, we can just tuck our wires away. Works on this back section here. Now the first side we're going to do is the rudder, which is going to line up right to here. To do that, we just have to make sure that the servo goes in first, or servo control horn goes in first. It's like to open it up. Make it a little easier to go in. Make sure that hole is right in line with the hinge line. The first thing we got to do is make sure that our control horns are centered, or our control surfaces are centered, by putting at least one piece of tape down here and one piece of tape at the top counterbalance. You're just going to really lock it in place. Once you look at it from a bird's eye view, look at it from above and make sure it's straight. Take your Sharpie again. I'm going to go from the bottom up. So it lines up. There's going to be a little bit of an angle, so it's not going to be 90 degrees right here. Some of these with here can be a little tricky. Once we think that looks good, we can go ahead and glue it in. Because it's kind of like wants to push out, I'm just going to hold it in for a second, just to make sure that it's going to stay in and not pop out. So that's good. We can go ahead and work on our elevator section. Once we know that it's done drying, we can go ahead and test it out with our servo tester. Just make sure to take off the tape first. Notice that there's a little bit of choppiness in this rudder. So I'm going to line up straight. Just go ahead and open up that area again. better. And once we have that ready, we're going to have it ready and move on to the cockpit.
So here are all the pieces we're going to need for our cockpit. First thing we're going to go ahead and do is put the molded pieces off to the side. We're going to focus on this piece. And this piece is a little tricky if you don't understand it, but I try to make it all on one side, as in everything you do is on one side.
What we're going to have is we're going to have a double bevel here, an opening here, and an opening here. What we mean by opening is just cracking it open like that, like that. What this is going to do is this is going to fold over, this is going to fold under, and this is going to fold over like that. First thing we can do is we can do the double bevel. Make sure you have a sharp blade. And from here what we can do is we can go ahead and peel this paper off here, but not in the middle. Now we're not going to use most of this over here. This is just for having leverage when we actually glue the piece down. See here, first thing we can do, just test fit this. Make sure these two marks line up with the rectangle piece here. Once that seems good, go ahead and glue it down. Once that's done and glued, we can go ahead and actually keeping this piece on the ground. Instead of trying to fold this up, we're going to pick this whole piece up and just kind of roll it onto the piece with the paper off, just till it's about 90 degrees. Go ahead and grab a triangle. I'm just going to put it behind it. And make sure when you're doing this, it doesn't necessarily need to be 90 degrees, but apply firm pressure down, and that's where you're going to focus all your attention on. We were going to do this. Just put more glue than you need. Go from all the way on one side to the other. Roll it over. Don't worry about the excess glue just yet. Once you feel comfortable holding it, go ahead and smear it off. This is going to make it keep its angle without wanting to come apart. And we're going to want to hold this one for a decent amount of time, just because this, if anything is going to come apart, it's going to be this piece. Once you've given it enough time, you'll notice that it'll keep its shape very well. It has those iconic lines of the zero. Do the same thing to the other side now. Test fit it once. Once that's all glued, it really starts to give off the iconic shape of the zero. We can go ahead and take this flap down, make sure it lines up. Put glue, not on this piece, but on the actual piece where the guns will be. Just apply pressure like this. And this thing's going to fold right over. I'm going to glue that too. Actually glue that while we're gluing the other one. Put glue on the actual piece. Just do the same thing. Now we're going to hold off on putting the guns in just yet, just because we'll make sure it's actually level with the plane. For this front part here, this is going to be constantly put in and out of the plane, so we're going to want to crush this front edge here, just to kind of round it a little bit. And then we're going to take a piece of clear tape. We're going to wrap it around it to make sure it doesn't go anywhere. Just be careful cracking it like I just did, of course. Shouldn't matter when it's on the plane though. This will make it last forever basically, and be easier to put in and out of the plane. Just make sure to trim off any excess, because odds are it won't really fit in the plane too well. Once that's done, we can go ahead and move this off to the side. We can go ahead and look at all our cockpit pieces here. First thing we can do, we go ahead and remove a lot of paper on stuff. We can start by using this big piece. Now if you have put center marks, do the other side, just so we can always know where the center of the piece is, along with all the other pieces. Now for this piece, we can actually take this whole section off here and crack it and take off all the foam. Now for these individual pieces, we're not going to mold any of these pieces, we're just going to bevel them. This will make it super lightweight and technically easier to bevel without the paper being there. We can go ahead and crack open some of these. First thing we can do is we can actually bevel all of these front edges here. We're going to give it a pretty good bevel, just because this is going to line up with the gun section / fuselage section. See here, that's about the bevel we're going for. Really make sure you have that sharp blade. This piece of paper is just kind of going to fall into the side of the plane, so that's why we don't have to worry about it. Next place of beveling we can do is in this inside edge here. Make sure it's flat and has a nice crease line. We're not going to bevel the rectangle part. We're going to bevel this side part. Now for these cockpit pieces, it's easier to just do more than you need. So I'm going at a good 45-degree angle, or 50. Just like that, because we don't need that much, but it's just better to have. Make sure they're generally equal. Now we can either bevel this part or this part. Either one doesn't really matter. I'm going to go ahead and do a smaller piece on the outside. About the same angle. As long as you bevel it and you know that it goes past 90 degrees from this piece, then you're set. Just be careful of your fingers here. That looks pretty good. You don't need to bevel these sides or anything. We're going to actually take our other piece, and now this back part here and this part is going to line up with the back of this gun piece. So just kind of roughly watch it as it's here. We're not going to put it on yet, we're just test fitting it. But overall that looks pretty good. And when we get to this section, we're not actually going to glue these sides down where the paper is just, it's only the paper. Because that's going to go over the side of the plane, or the side of the molded piece there. But overall, it looks pretty good. For this next piece, we don't have to do anything to it. For this piece, we have to bevel the front edge with this curve. Nothing crazy, just a shallow bevel, just to make the pieces line up easier. We don't have to do the back side. For this piece, we're going to have to do every angle, because this is going to go on the back of the plane here, and it has to be flat and flush. Now, from going from here to here, this is a stronger angle, and basically the rule of thumb is the stronger the angle is, the more of an angle you're going to have to bevel. So I'm just going at about there for reference, a little past 45-degree bevel. And then for the outside edge, the side that's going to touch the fuselage, we're going to want to put a really strong bevel, just because we want it to be flush against the side of the plane. And I'm basically using about as much as I can with the knife, and being very consistent across the whole way. It's easiest to use a sawing action to get the steepest bevel. See, that's a pretty decent bevel. And we're actually going to go ahead and do that to all the other pieces as well. By doing that same exact bevel that we did. Just kind of watch the angle that it was at. See what it was and try and match it. Once we have these larger pieces done, this tiny piece isn't tricky, it's just you have to get all the little bevels here and there. Like for this back section, going to cut about a 45-degree bevel. This piece isn't technically almost even foam board in a way. It's almost just paper for what we need it to be. And do about the same angle bevel to each little corner and angle. And for this piece, it really helps to get close to the paper, because the closer you can get on this piece, the cleaner the front of the cockpit will be. Once we have all these pieces done, we can go ahead and kind of mold them. Just by taking them to a table edge and molding them like any other piece. With all the paper with all the foam we removed, it's going to be a little easier to bend and mold. Now we don't need a strong angle at the bottom here. It's actually going to be relatively flat. Just focus more on the bigger sections and the top and the middle of the piece. A good way to tell how much you have to bevel, or how much to mold, is by where all the curves in the piece are. Like you can tell here it's relatively straight, but here it's pretty curved on the piece. So that kind of tells you where you have to mold. Now obviously on straight pieces you can't really tell, but it's just where they line up with the other pieces. You can actually test this by putting this little former piece in the straight piece. Just kind of setting it in place and watching how it falls into the piece. We can actually go ahead and glue this. This will kind of be a good reference to make sure everything else is going off this one piece. Once you feel good, actually, just watch how far it goes down. I'm going to kind of stay away from the places where the bevels are, just because I want to watch those. So I'm going to go right where the bevel starts and go to where it starts on the other side. I'm kind of holding this in a way that if the bevels weren't there, the foam would be there. Just so that way it kind of stays true to shape. Just make sure it's centered. But these little edges here are going to fall on the side of the fuselage, so that's why they're so thin. Once it's done drying, we can kind of take the next piece and just test fit it. Might not be perfect just because it's a little off. It looks pretty good. I like to glue these molded pieces that kind of can't wrap around themselves. Just kind of like to line it up. Just take a piece of tape, put it on the center. Now I can really watch it while knowing it's centered. And once we know it's good, I'm just going to put a drop of glue in the center. This way we'll just know that it'll stay centered when we're trying to glue it, even with the tape there. See that I'm just holding it. You could use tape to hold on the sides. I just prefer to use my fingers, just so I have constant control of it at all times. Watch the joint. Now if you're seeing a little bit of kind of a stepping stone where it goes past the piece in front of it, don't worry about that just yet. We can trim that off later. Some cockpits are designed like that, like a lot of German planes were designed like that. But in this case, the Zero did not have that. Once it feels good, I'm going to put tape. I'm going to keep holding it like this. Take some tape, put it on the side of the piece. This way we know it still lines up. Same thing for the other side. And once we have that together, by putting tape on that side, we know that the pieces are together. And by doing this, put all the glue inside there. Just be careful of the warmth in your fingers. By doing this, we know that there's a really strong joint there. And if you want to smear this with your fingers, beware because there's a lot of glue here. But because the glue or the foam is so thin over here, it's best to do this so we know there's a really strong joint with the paper being on the outside. So we can just smear it and not have to worry about it. Just make sure if you do have a lot of glue out right here, make sure it's flat. Just so when we actually put it on the plane, all said and done, it'll be nice and clean. As you can see here, there's a little bit of a stepping stone there with the pieces. So what I'm going to do is take a ruler, line it up roughly, making it even. It's a little awkward to hold. Then I'm just going to take the ruler as my friend and just kind of guide this along the piece evenly and across. That makes it nice and flat. Same thing for the other side. Be a little tricky being a right-handed or left-handed, just depending on how you do this. This way the molded pieces don't have to be perfect, or your gluing doesn't have to be completely perfect. The only thing you might have to do, to make it super clean, is bevel your edge slightly, more where the thicker parts are. Doesn't need to be all the way across, just to there, just so it's only the paper. And there, you just fixed it. Once that's done, we can go ahead and test fit the next piece behind it. Now for this piece, I'm going to glue it at the side first. Actually, I'm going to line it up, make sure it's straight. I'm going to tape it in. Do some tape on the other side. Holding with our fingers again. As you can see here, I have a little bit of stepping stone again. It's no big deal. It's going to be a little different with this piece being a curve, but I'll show you how to do that as well. Here I'm going to do the same thing. Put a bunch of glue in there, enough to where you can smear it and make a clean seam. It'll be easy to hold it against your chest or the table. Smear this. Just kind of see from the side it has the zero shape. Now the way to get rid of the step up here is you kind of just have to, on the inside of the plane, just kind of draw flat. Just try to transition it as best you can into the curve so it looks even. It doesn't have to be perfect. Just kind of look at it. And once it's set, just take your ruler, smooth it out if you even need to again. And from the top it might tell a different story too. It's a little bit of a corner there. Just gonna trim that corner. And that looks good. Same thing on the other side. You can kind of start at the curve and then slide into it. And then it looks super clean. Transitions nicely. Don't forget to just go back and bevel it again. leave the tape on for just a little longer. From here we can kind of test this. We're going to go ahead and flatten out these sides just by scrunching them together a little bit, pinching it. And we're going to glue this. We're actually glue these together. Just kind of test fit, line it up. So they're starting to get the zero shape. We'll put tape all along the one side here. Match it up evenly. As long as the piece is flat on the one side, it should work. We're going to crack this open though. Then we're going to glue it together. Make sure the tape is down pretty good. Just keep pinching it as you're gluing this. Just kind of rotate it open, make sure how clean it is. Once that's good, just keep pinching it for this part. Make sure to really smear that glue on this part here, because that's really going to make the pieces stay together and not come apart mid-flight. What we're looking for is just this piece to be flat, so you can almost use the table as your friend. Just make sure it's flat. That'll give it a clean seam on the outside. Once we know the drying time's good, we can pick it up, test fit it over to the other side, see how it fits. Should line up pretty good. Once we see that, take another new piece of tape just so we know it's strong. I'm going to put it on the piece of the front windshield. This we're not really going to be able to do the same way as the other side because we can't really open it up. What we're going to do is we're going to put glue on the inside piece here. I'm just going to mark where the tape ends, or where the, see here I'm marking where the foam on the top ends with the cockpit. Make sure the glue is tight to this piece by pressing it together. Put glue all along that piece. When we go to glue this, make sure to kind of slide the glue in to the inside of the piece and not the outside of the plane. Once it's taped, again bring it to the table edge or tabletop. Smear it. Just hold it again. This is done drying. Once it's done drying, we can kind of take off all the other pieces. As we're waiting for it to dry, we can kind of test fit it. And these little, now because the paper and the foam is completely peeled off here, kind of adds like a little lip here on each side that we can kind of line up this gun section piece to. Now if you have a bunch of glue built up here, if we put glue there and it flattens it down, if we have a bunch of glue here, it's going to flatten it down anyway if we put more glue on it. So see, here's a little bit of a gap there for that same reason. Now the way we're going to glue this is we're going to put glue all along these inside edges. You can put them along the seam lines as well to make sure it doesn't do this. And then we're also put some right here and here. Make sure you have the tape on the outside. Not here. All the glue on those edges. Not on the places where the paper is or the foam was peeled off there. What grab would be your foam, let it drop up for a second instead of down. Now from here, go ahead and put these pieces on. Make sure they're lined up with the back there. And make sure you have the pieces where the foam was peeled off completely, just floating. So that way you know that there's no glue there. Make sure your cockpit looks lined up straight. Also, the foam board is in those little pockets. Once you know it's done drying, we can sort of take the tape off. As you can see, it's a very clean seam, and that when we move this piece doesn't get affected because they're very joined together from the glue on the outside, or on the inside. That is the same deal over here. What you're going to see is you're going to see a little bit of a gap here, a little bit of a gap here anyway, so that when we put it on the fuselage, it'll fit very nicely. From here, all I have to do is put this little piece on. So always dry fit it first. And depending on how you actually glue your cockpit, this piece might be a little off. One way to do it is either glue it first and then trim it later. In this case, I kind of know where I have to trim, so I'm going to slightly trim it. Now this one I'm going to recommend using your fingers to put in, just so we know it's always in the right spot. There's no trick to this. I'm just going to glue on all sides here. Doesn't need to be too heavy, but also doesn't need to be too little, or else it won't really stick. Watch your fingers in case any glue came out. Once we have that glued, we're ready to go ahead and put it on the cockpit and finish up our final details.
So now that we have our airframe here and our cockpit piece, we can go ahead and test it in. You notice it's a little, mine's a little tight here. No big deal. I'm not going to try and bother cutting here. I'm just take a barbecue skewer and just kind of rough up the sides.
Just so that way it's going to be a little bit of a bigger space to go through. Just not to jam through all the way through. Just kind of more push to the side. Not trying to necessarily push up. This piece is included anyway, so just go back and test it again. Seems a little better. Then we're putting this piece down. We're going to slide it all the way forward. And you'll notice that when we push it down, it's either going to go down or not go down. What we're looking for here is these sides on each of them to go up and to go out. Just kind of look for those on each side. That's basically like a stage process of doing it in stages. I'm going to do that one. Now we're looking for any imperfections with the actual sides of the molded pieces here. For example, this side looks perfect. We go over this side, it's a little bit of a crinkle right here, or grouped together. Now if we push it down, it's going to stay like that and look awesome. But if we let go of it, it's going to pop back up. We just haven't put a rubber band in for our hatch yet, and that's what we're going to do next.
But while we're at it here, we can kind of get an idea of how to put the guns in for the canopy. And then we're going to do it. I'm just going to kind of line these up here. Just go in like that. Make sure they're straight. Just kind of mark them. Make sure your cockpit actually stays on. Kind of line them up with each other. Doesn't need to be perfect. Go ahead and take the cockpit out. Best way to take it out is either by holding it right here at the front, or right where you have the former. From there we can go ahead and just finish these through. Poke a decent hole in it. Same thing on the other side. Once we have that, we're going to go ahead and take a coffee stir, poking it on the inside. I've just been looking at it from above.
We're going to go just past this front lip here, just to about there. So if we put that in, it's going to look very clean. Almost there. In reality, there'd be a gun hole here, but we're not worried about that just yet. You can do that if you want, just I'm not worried about it. And up the other side. Once that's done, we're going to actually go ahead and set up our rubber band for our cockpit. Now, the best way to do this, you can take a rubber band just like this actually. Just put your wires aside so they're out of the way. And we're going to poke barbecue skewer right into the middle section here, just about halfway down, just like this. And poke it a decent way back because we want this to be really strong. Now if you're going to grip the plane, grip it right where this former D is, just so that way you're not crushing the paper with foam. As you can see, I went pretty far back on that one, and I leave it just to there. Once it's all set, see here, just for reference, this is a about 2 3/4 inch barbecue skewer with the point on the end. Now you really don't even need to glue it, but I'm just going to put a drop of glue just to say I glued it at the dot. Just do the same thing again. Just like that. Just so it would be flat and a little across. You don't want to have it angling up because the rubber band's going to stay on it. Next what we're going to do is take another rubber band. We're going to take the cockpit piece, just about the middle of the cockpit here, doesn't matter where. Poke a slight hole in it. We're going to come across at about to there. I'm going to slightly measure it from here to there. We're going to mark about this long of a piece. We're going to measure a 3-inch long barbecue skewer. Go ahead and trim it. Pointy end helps for this one. Stick it in here. Now I'm not going to go at that angle. We're going to go about flat, just like that. Go right to almost where the back of this is. Just going to stick it in just like that. Now watch it so it doesn't come out the other side. See, I just see a little bubble there. So that's how I know I'm almost going through all the way. Once that's there, I usually like to mess with it from there, so I'm just going to glue it in like this. Just be careful, don't put too much glue in the back here, just so that way you don't go or open up that glue again. Just going to twist it a couple of times. Shove it forward and then back. Twist it again. This is what's going to keep our rubber band in place. Now it doesn't matter what size rubber band you have, as long as it's not too big, I guess, but we're going to have to tie it down to fit the size of the plane. My rubber bands. We'll put our rubber bands out of the way, but we're going to try and put them inside the plane so they're away from the rubber band part. Now you could have a perfect rubber band that fits true to size and just stays here, and it's going to stay like that. But if we look at the rubber band on the other Zero, you can see that it's about that size. So I'm going to try and match that with this one just because I have a copy of it. If you want this one, the size I found for the other one, it's about 1 3/4 inch, 2 inches ish. Depends on the strength of your rubber band. So you go ahead and snip it. Gonna measure measure it just so I... Now this rubber band is just kind of going to be free. It doesn't need to be glued in place or anything. Because just in case it breaks and you need to make a new one. Then the easiest way to do this is just kind of grip it here first. And from friction it's going to stay on. We're going to pull it back slightly. And from here, make sure all of it lines up.
And there you go. You have the cockpit on, you have the guns on, everything's in place. The only thing we have left to do are the engine flaps and the wing fairings. So now for our wing fairings, it only consists of 2 pieces. Now, usually wing fairings can be a little tricky, so I like to do it on a side first that I don't feel as confident about. Like, this side has a little bit more crinkles, so I'm going to do it on this side first. Also, I'm going to label which side is which, put each one on which one.
So now for our wing fairings, it only consists of 2 pieces. Now, usually wing fairings can be a little tricky, so I like to do it on a side first that I don't feel as confident about. Like, this side has a little bit more crinkles, so I'm going to do it on this side first. Also, I'm going to label which side is which, put each one on which one. Obviously, as usual, start off by peeling the paper. And there's just a lot of beveling. You can also sand this down to get a really, really angled piece. The more you bevel it, the more it'll have the inverse curve. Using the sawing motion is easiest. Just be careful with going through the paper on this front pointy part. Because it's a relatively thin fairing, it's going to be really easy to inverse mold. Now you can just glue these on flat once you bevel them, but it just looks a little better if you have a inverse curve. So like for example, you could just put this on like normal here. Just like that. But I think the inverse curve looks better. Now the way to do the inverse curve is to take the biggest roll of tape you have, or a PVC pipe, and we're just going to take a Sharpie and slightly push down on this in the opposite way you would of molding. And then you go back to there. You notice it's a very shallow with a bigger one, but when you move to a tinier piece of tape, it's going to curve a little bit more. You need a piece of tape. Just gonna grab you can grab a hammer blade, something really, really curved. Anything curved will work. Slowly roll it over. Something curved like this is going to make it curve a lot more. As you can see there, it's pretty curved. Just from that, we have a really cool curve. Go ahead and test it. That looks pretty good. So what I'm going to do is take my blade, just etch in the foam slightly where it lines up. So we know where to glue it. Once we know that, go ahead and glue it down. Slide it back. Now to make things even, what we're going to do is take a ruler, and I usually like to measure from the point at where the fairing starts to the aileron hinge, and we can measure how far it is, so we can see exactly where we need to put the fairing on the other side. It can be different for everyone. But once you have that, we're going to do the same thing to the other side. Okay, so once we have our ring fingers on and everything, the only thing we have to do is put our power pod in, put our exhausts on, and we're ready to fly. Okay, so for the last part of the build, it's going to be kind of like the fine details of setting up our electronics and everything. But the first thing we're going to do is the engine exhaust. Now, these two pieces here are actually the same piece. They're just two different styles. This one here you can see is the width of foam when you get it at the dollar store for flight test, wherever you want. But with this one, all we did is we put it in a vise, and it gets it really thin and everything. What this is going to do is it's going to allow for a lot thinner look on the side of the exhausts. Because the way we're going to do this, we're going to pop these exhaust flaps out about a width of foam out, so they stick out just like this on the outside of the frame. Now to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, so here's the completed Zero I have. You can see here it's a little tiny flap that just comes out, just like the real one has. But you can see it's very thin, thinner than the foam board. If you want to get detailed, you can also add, you can take a heating iron and round it just a little bit, so it's slightly rounded, along with a little dark exhaust in the back of it, like the actual hole there. So that's the look we're going for. But if you use this, it's going to kind of be, it's not going to look weird, but it's just going to be a little off from scale. It just depends on what you're willing to do. But another note is that if you decide to paint your Zero, it's a lot easier to put these pieces on after you paint them. So I recommend, if you're going to try and paint your Zero, leave these off for now. I'm not even going to do that for this one because we're going to plan on painting this one. We're going to put these off to the side.
And then the other thing we have to do the exhaust from here is just stick them out with the foam away from the former. And then we're just going to glue those down and in place. Usually like to go around the world with this one. Start up at one, just keep going around until we get to the other side. If you want, you can take out your cockpit for this one, just so you can rest it upside down. Just need a drop. And once you have it glued, just hold it in place. So now obviously if you are building the earlier version with these enclosed, you don't have to worry about anything about the exhausts. But still go with the one width away from the former / foam. You can see there from the front view, there's a very cool and iconic shape to it. Now from here it's pretty much just fixing up wires, getting it ready to fly. We've already have our cockpit set. What we're going to do is we can bring our receiver over, and our ESC, also our power pod. I'm using an old receiver for this, but plug stuff in where it should go. Ailerons into ailerons. Make sure you check your servos, make sure you know which one they go to.
In this case we did the X version, so this servo's for the rudder. I'll do the elevator first though. Now if you're using a newer receiver, you don't have to worry about it because it probably doesn't have a antenna sticking out like this one does. But if you have an antenna, the best place I found to put it is right over here with some Velcro away from everything, and the antenna is going to stick back in this little divot down here, just back here. So I'm going to grab some Velcro and put that down. In the meantime, we can take our other power pod if you don't have one, or you can take this one. Now I will say the problem is getting this ESC to fit in properly, and this is the way it's going to do it. This way I found is to take it out like this, kind of make it fold over on itself, put the XC30 connector like that, or whatever connector you're using, go like that, and like that. It's going to be inverted. This way, just kind of use gravity as your friend. So now the way I designed this is I designed it so that the power pod sits almost right up against this box bar holding the power pod in. So what we're going to do is we're going to slightly pull our power pod out. Okay, so once you've gone ahead and put all your electronics in, put your power pod in, you notice that you have a nice clean layout here with all your receiver off to the side, with your antenna back there. Now the other thing that's going to be a little tight is your battery bay, but there's an easy way to get around that. So I'm going to show you right now. Using a 3S 850 milliamp battery, The best way to put it in is by first, when you're at the field, turning on your transmitter. And then from there, it's supposed to actually plug in the battery first to the lead. This can be a little tricky, which is finding the right angle. And once it's plugged in, you can kind of twist the battery in a way. First, make sure there's no wires getting in the way. When I'm twisting, I'm kind of making sure the fuzzy side or the Velcro side is on the bottom, and it's kind of lined up to go in the battery bay. And it's just gonna slide in. I'm gonna hook on some Velcro. The first couple tries are going to be a little tight for the battery bay. Just take your time and don't force anything. Now, if you're using the same battery as me, or 13thSA50, you're going to want to push it up right up to the firewall, or the box bar off the back here. This gives us a nice center of gravity, along with everything spaced out nicely. Now from here we can actually go ahead and make sure our plane's balanced right. Just like usual, we're going to put our rubber band in, put it on the barbecue skewer, make sure everything's fitting right.
Now from there, we basically have a finished plane. The only thing to check is our center of gravity, which is 1 5/8 inch back from the leading edge here at the middle. As long as you line that up, move your fingers out. A little tail heavy. All we have to do is move our battery slightly more forward. This one I need the rubber band, just to make sure. Actually balanced pretty good. Now all we have to do is just take it for a flight, bring it back down. After we're going to take the battery out, best way to do that, first unplug the leads. And there we have our battery. We're all set. Charge it up, go for another flight. Now all we have to do is put our prop on, take it to the field, and go fly it.
Alright, now that Jack has done all the easy stuff, it's time for me to finish up, you know, the hard stuff. So, alright, I'm going to teach you guys a little trick that's all over the forums. Everybody talks about doing it, but I don't see a lot of people doing it all the time, so I don't know why they don't, because it really makes it look a lot nicer. So we're going to go out and we're going to round these edges of the final foam in the front here, the leading edges here, and around the sides right over here. And we found that rounding out the back side doesn't look as good. Just my own personal opinion. If you want to do it, I'm not going to stop you from doing it, but that's just kind of what we don't like to do. So, all right, I'm going to take some scrap, make sure this this iron's hot. But now this iron is just like a monocoat. It's a monocoat iron. You know, that you use these for, you know, shrinking the monocoat on the balsa planes. But I bought this at a swap meet in Toledo. That was, I think we got it for $5 or something. So it was really, you can always go to swap meet and get it. So I'm going to go along. See how the edges are sharp here? So, you know, you can go along here and just let it go. You'll see that it rounds the edges. So that's kind of the effect we're going to go with. And it's just a feel type thing. You get used to it after a while, and you just know how much pressure it takes and how much time to be on the foam before it curls over. And it gives it a nice softer edge. So we'll do the other side. And of course, I got to look above my glasses because my eyes are getting old and I can't see that much So look at that. That's a nice, cool edge. I don't know if you can see that well in the picture, but that's cool. All right. So let's get this elevator. That looks nice. Nice rounded edge. Slowly smooth it out. Now that looks a lot nicer. Look at that. Alright, let's get the other side. I do have this on high, so I don't know if that's a temperature you guys used to, but that's what I like to use for when I do this. Alright. Now do the front of the rudder. And that's what it looks like right now. So let's see what it looks like after this. Alright, see, that looks a lot nicer. It just looks more finished off that way, guys. I like the look of that. Alright, now we're going to do the leading edges, or around the outside edges here. It also gives a little more strength to the foam when you do this. So here's what it looks like now. Let's see what it looks like when we're done. There, see that? Just rounds it off, guys. That looks really good. Alright. Let's do the other side. And again, we don't want to go past that because it's the trailing edge. Unless you want to. I'm not going to stop you. I just don't like the look of that. But alright. Now that looks much better there, so it's a simple trick, guys. It's easy to do. It makes the plane look a lot better. So, got one more trick though. Jack doesn't like me doing this, but I'm going to do it anyways. So I'm going to do it here. See all that glue on there? There's some little trick you guys can do here. Sometimes, now you don't want to do it right on the seam and keep it all, because otherwise you're going to separate the seam and it's going to split open. So you got to be careful. So if you want to smooth that out, sometimes you can kind of go along this here and just go there, and it'll smooth some of that out. But you don't want to get it too hot because it will split the seams. Also makes it a little shinier. But yeah, see that big glob of glue there? Try to smooth that out.
Only do it if you have experience.
So, but that smooths that glue joint out. See those little splotches of glue there? Look at it, it's all smooth now. So, Jack is freaking out right now. He's like, don't do that. But I'm going to do it anyways. So, but that glue joint looks a lot better now, guys. Especially when you spray paint it over with your paint later, it'll be a much smoother joint. And it won't be as globby. If that's a word, globby. But I'm going to use it anyways. Alright, guys. Okay. So there's a little bit smoother glue joint there, guys. Alright, so that's some little tips to do before you guys, and also I use a little paper towel. Don't burn yourself doing this, guys, because you get wax or the glue all over this, and you just wipe it off here. But be careful because you don't want to burn yourself. one other thing, guys, if you are going to paint this thing, you're going to want to sand your plane down first. You don't want to spray paint it unless you're using the Dollar Tree stuff. That doesn't need to be sanded down at all because that doesn't have a waxy surface on it. The flight test foam board has a waxy surface on it, so you don't want to use 000 or quadruple 0, and you'll sand the whole thing down and spray paint it then. But other than that, that's pretty much all you got to do, and there it is. Maybe Jack might have a few more words to say about it if he wants.
One thing I will say, we tried putting the heating iron on the cockpit seams before, and it just made it look kind of weird. I wouldn't recommend it, but if someone could find a way to make it look cool, sweet. But I figured I'd just tell you. So.
All right. Talk to you later, guys. Hope you like the kit. All right. See ya.